So here's a hoopla that I want to make a little bit of a video on because it's very interesting to talk about. Now, we're all anime fans here, right? We enjoy animes, we love to watch animes, it's the good stuff these days. So of course you have heard the term tsundere. It's usually used to describe characters who are really insecure about themselves, and thanks to their insecurity, they are unable to really express what their true feelings are. They have to hide it with something else. If they offer you help towards something, they're probably gonna say, well, I'm helping you because you look like in trouble. It's not that I like you or anything, baka. That's good and all, but what's happening with tsunderes that I need to make a video on them? Well, what if I tell you that there is a game that translates the word tsundere to fragile male ego? Enter the house in Fata Morgana, a game that I've seen popping quite a lot of times on Steam sales. It's a gothic visual novel telling dark and disturbing stories. That game was released in 2016, and there was a little bit of a hoopla surrounding that game recently because the translator of the game came out and said their comment about a particular line. To put it short, the translator translated the line tsundere to fragile male ego. From that point on, everyone on the internet becomes outraged over this really odd translation. Why would you translate tsundere to fragile male ego? How can this particular translator comes into that conclusion? Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is a very interesting story. It's a story that I think is worth talking about with you guys, but this will require me to spoil a good portion of chapter 3 of the house in Fata Morgana. So if you don't like to be spoiled, I suggest either skipping this video or play the game until you reach the end of that point. So let's get into the spoilers. The House in Fata Morgana is a game where you are playing as a nameless person who won't be revealed until later on in the game. You wake up in a mysterious, creepy mansion with a maid guiding you through various doors that highlight various points in life of the people who have ever lived in the mansion. The relevant story for this video takes place in the third door. It is the 19th century. Our main character here is named Jacopo, a mafia who is rather abusive to his wife. A wife who has white hair and is only referred to that because it's spoiler territory. So let's name her Mary for now because she was compared to a Saint Mary by a maid. Mary and Jacopo were politically married, so they don't exactly have mutual feelings for each other. But Mary, being the really innocent saint that she is, believes that Jacopo is actually a kind-hearted man due to the way he treated her in the past. However, Jacopo has been rather emotionally abusive towards her recently due to a number of factors. His responsibility weighing down on him as a mafia member, and also his general insecurity. He has a lot of confidence in his abilities, but he has no confidence in himself. His insecurity is actually one of the many destructive forces that would torment him for a very long time. So who is this tsundere in this conversation? Well, it's actually Jacopo, and the reason why this tsundere term applies here is because he is incredibly insecure about himself, and especially his feelings towards his wife. His story is actually one of the most brutal deconstruction of the tsundere trope that I've seen in any fictional stories. Some tsunderes who have insecurities about their own feelings tend to be emotionally abusive to others. They also tend to not express their true feelings and will hide them away through layers and layers of excuses. The deconstruction part comes in when he suspects that his wife Mary is having an affair. He gets so paranoid that he decides to lock her up in a shed. He locked her up, but he didn't try to kill her because of his own repressed feeling for her. Now, how can the Saint Mary herself committed such atrocious and disloyal behavior towards her husband? Well, she didn't. What actually happened is his maid Maria, who is also his childhood friend, manipulating a lot of aspects on his life so that he can have the perception that Mary is cheating on him. When Jacopo decides to lock Mary up, Maria is the only means of communication between the two. Mary would write letters after letters trying to apologize to her husband, but Maria would manipulate that letter so that it reads like she's writing it to another man. And then Maria would give that forged letter to Jacopo, which leads him more and more into believing that Mary is having an affair, despite being locked in a shed. And this goes on for months. No, really. Months. They keep on not talking to each other for months and merely use Maria to communicate, if you can call it that. If Jacopo would scrub off all of his insecurities, if he would just be a little bit more confident in himself, if Mary is brave enough to stand up to all of his abuse, a lot of these issues would have been solved. And Maria is manipulating all of this because she wants to take some good old revenge on Jacopo's family for ruining hers. Since this is a gothic story, of course it's gonna end in a tragic manner, and I did say that I will spoil a good portion of the story, not the entire story. So if you are genuinely interested in how it ends, just play the game or read the wiki or something. Now, from that story alone, is there any part that suggests Jacopo having a fragile male ego? Actually, that fragile male ego line comes from the bonus backstage portion of the game, which means post-game content. In the original Japanese line, as illustrated by the translator, she says, "I came to see you, you stupid tsundere asshole." Thank you, YouTube. However, in the localized line, she says, "How is your fragile male ego holding up?" Now, maybe this is just me, but from what I understand on the story, I don't think Jacopo has a fragile male ego, or that his insecurity issues are thanks to him being a male. Would you describe female tsunderes as having a fragile female ego? I mean, they do have an ego, but it's not always due to them being a woman. But there is a reason why this very spoiler character Morgana calls Jacopo a tsundere. It's because of his insecurity. Him being emotionally insecure about himself, and especially his feelings towards others, would eventually lead into his constant emotional torment. And considering that we're talking about the backstage fourth wall breaking section of the game, it makes sense why the characters do not talk like how they were supposed to talk, like in, say, the 19th century. Calling the insecurity of a tsundere as the fragile ego of a specific gender is just odd, almost as if the translator has their own personal agenda against men in general. And boy, they do. In fact, I want to illustrate to you why we should not have people with inherent biases to be translating people's works. This translator is really proud of their work and would even brag about how it took a lot of brainstorming sessions over several weeks to come up with this translation. I'm sure that's an exaggeration, because if that is true, the people working at Manga Gamer are idiots. Tsundere is a trope used to describe characters who are insecure about their emotions. If you really have to change the tsundere line, change it to, "I came to talk to you, you insecure asshat," or something. It fits with the character's internal dilemma, and it is a core component of what makes a tsundere. You know what? If you're gonna associate tsundereness with fragile gender insecurity, I suppose we can attribute that to the rest of the tsunderes. This character over here, she's not insecure about her feelings and expressions. She just has a fragile female ego. Actually, depending on who you ask, I think fragile female ego can be used to describe some of them accurately. But if you are going to use the word fragile male ego to describe a male tsundere, and you considered it an appropriate translation, surely describing a female tsundere as having a fragile female ego would be appropriate too, right? Of course not, because this is the double standard that a lot of these activists love to impose in our society. When men are insecure about themselves and acting like a tsundere, it is perfectly justifiable to call them out for having a fragile masculinity. But when it's women who are insecure about themselves and acting like a tsundere, there's no such thing as fragile femininity, because women can do no wrong. Now, Jacopo is a particularly extreme example of this trope, and calling him a tsundere is not exactly representative of his whole character. I can totally understand the change. It's just that fragile male ego is also not representative of his whole character. As I said before, calling him insecure is a lot more powerful actually. He is a mafia man who got crushed by such a simple human problem. He should have been a powerful and menacing figure. When he walks into the bar, everybody would shut up because they respect him and no one dares to disrespect him or his queen even. But you can't exactly be respected if you don't don't have a lot of confidence or even respect towards your own self. Besides, a mafia man having insecurity issues is just the most pathetic thing in the world, right? So to put it short, a translator who is biased against men translated some portion of a game so that it's biased against men. So it's no surprise that their translation would change something like tsundere to fragile male ego. In fact, the translator has provided their interpretation of the events, which are incredibly misleading. First off, Maria did get accepted into Jacopo's family as a maid, but her being a woman is not the primary reason. She is a member of the family that Jacopo's mafia killed for being too conservative and destructive, as explained in the ending of the chapter. Making her a maid significantly reduces her status so that she doesn't get a lot of power. The translator is correct for saying that Jacopo is manipulated by Maria into thinking that Mary is cheating on him, and that his inner insecurities and inability to truly have confidence on himself are his ultimate downfall. However, the translator is incorrect for saying that Maria takes advantage of Jacopo through his insecurities as a man. As a husband and potential couple? Sure. But as a man? The translator didn't elaborate on that any further. What part of him being a man that makes him insecure? How can his insecurity issues being attributed on him being a man? It makes sense for characters like Naoto from Persona 4, where her cross-dressing as a man shows her lack of confidence on being a woman, and a detective, thanks to the gender roles being imposed on her by society. It doesn't make sense for Jacopo, who has insecurities for sure, but not because he's a man. The translator continues to elaborate their explanation, and they just fundamentally misunderstood why Jacopo is called a tsundere in that fourth wall break scene. The translator says that him being called a tsundere refers to the fact that while he proclaimed to love his wife, he only ever managed to hurt her, and thus highlighting his insecurity and inability to truly express himself. But the writer seems to be on the impression that people who play visual novels do not understand what tsundere means, and therefore that is a perfectly acceptable line to change, which is again very odd considering that this is a fourth wall breaking joke segment after the game where it is perfectly acceptable to be out of character. Finally, the translator concluded on the thread saying that rather than a translation of the word itself, the fragile male ego line is a translation of the ideas embodied in the word tsundere. But again, that will mean that being a tsundere means that you have a gender-related fragile ego. It's not accurate when it's being done to describe Rin, for example, and it's not accurate here either. The translator continues by saying that Jacopo's downfall is brought about by his hesitation to stray from societal's expectations of masculinity, and that it's a clear character flaw recognized to all readers. No, it's not. If you're talking about Kairi from Cold Steel 3, maybe you'd have a point, but Jacopo's character flaw is his insecurity and his lack of confidence toward himself and his wife, not his fragile masculinity, if you can even define that, or his hesitation to stray from societal's expectation of masculinity. I don't recall a time where Jacopo is expected to be manly, even though he isn't, in the same way that Kairi does. Heck, I did bring up Persona 4, so might as well as bring Kanji. His masculinity is definitely one of his issues. This is a terribly inaccurate interpretation of what happened in the game. The translator accentuates their gender when it's not really a significant part of it. The chapter's main theme is about insecurity and the lack of confidence on both Jacopo and Mary, brought completely under the boots of a master manipulator who seeks on revenge. Not Jacopo is a man with fragile masculinity that emotionally abuses his wife. So you can see how the writer's inaccurate interpretation of the game can cloud their judgment in their translation. Now, this is coming from a game released in 2016, which has been brought to people's attention once again due to the translator running their mouth on Twitter. I have played the game, and for the most part, I can assure you that at least 99% of the game doesn't consist of the male bias that this particular translator has. themselves. Not even chapter 3, the chapter that stars the aforementioned characters, accentuate the character's gender as the most important part of the conversation. It's just the translator's own interpretation of the event, and them attributing it to gender. So at the end of the day, it's just a couple of lines on a fourth wall break segment. I can ignore a couple of lines in the game as long as 99% of the game is still dark and intriguing, and Fata Morgana is still dark and intriguing. I'd even recommend it for those who are looking for a gothic horror visual novel. However, what I cannot ignore is the translator's bias towards men, one that can potentially cloud their judgment in their work, and it has in that particular line. What I cannot ignore is the translator's lack of understanding on the most common Japanese media trope and misattributing that to the issues of gender due to their own personal bias. What I cannot ignore is Manga Gamer and the developer themselves not doing their own research to their own game. The line itself isn't the problem. It's what it represents that is the problem. It represents the fact that even the most niche of fandoms can get invaded by ideologues who will spew their personal biases towards the fictional works that they're translating. I might need to do another video in regards to gatekeeping these ideologues from the fandom, but one, it's too little too late, and two, even if you try to gatekeep these ideologues from the fandom years ago, that still doesn't change the fact that the Western society as a whole has a problem with constantly accepting and spewing these toxic ideas left and right. But that's for another video. All I can say for now is whatever biases that you have against society in general, you cannot let that override your line of work that requires you to be unbiased. If you want a line of work that allows you to be biased, try blogging or something.